Welcome to part two of our production pipeline series. Today we're going to be UV mapping our little guy after we finished modeling him in the last video. For this step, however, we want to do a little bit of housekeeping before we do this next step. And once again, this is mainly going to be a how-to process video, not so much theory. UV mapping is both surprisingly simple yet very complex if you don't know what you're doing. So the main purpose is just showing you guys where the settings are, what buttons to press, etc. For the actual theory, well, that's what the class is going to be mainly about. But before that, I want to make sure of a couple of things. You'll notice that I added some eyes versus the other video. Pretty simple. What I did was just grab a box and then I smoothed it. Basically, whenever you smooth a cube, it turns into a sphere if it doesn't have any supporting edges. Then gave it like two subdivisions. We scaled it. It's kind of giving that same shape that I had in the concept. And then we placed it. And I can just go ahead and mirror this. In here, what I ended up doing was actually separating after I mirrored. So once I positioned the eye, you can go to Mesh, Mirror. And if I do it from the left side or his right side, the eye will essentially just collapse in on itself because we're mirroring in the same axis. So we just go over to our settings and change the direction from negative to positive. That brings it back. And then we can go ahead and go back to Mesh and then separate, and that'll give us different geometry for eyes mainly. And I have to make sure that we are centering the pivots so that the eye actually follows this general area. Now, eyes we can definitely go back to. I definitely discuss that in class better for how to UV map them and properly mirror them so we don't have to do the same thing twice. But you know, just aesthetic purposes, I wanted to add them. Now, things we have to do before actually jumping into UV mapping. First and foremost, and we did this last video, was make sure that we don't have any transformations stored in the channel box. That's why we freeze transformations, make sure that all of the objects that we're going to be UV mapping have 0 scale or the scale set to 1, no translation, no rotation, because that will impact the result of the UV map. Secondly, we're making sure that we are deleting any and all history by clicking this button over here, or by going over to edit, delete all by type history, and that deletes the history of all objects in our scene. This is essentially just emptying out the cache or the construction history that essentially is stored in every object that we make. So now that we have that out of the way, oh, and lastly, make sure that the pivot, in case of most objects or props, you want to put them in the bottom. If there's a specific hinge or axis, for example, an eye, obviously you want to keep the eyes, their pivot, you want to keep them centered for rotation, or in this case, mainly translation, right? So now we are just about ready. Now I just have to make sure that all of my objects are properly named. Again, this is for convenience, bit of housekeeping before continuing on. So I'm going to make sure that all of the objects have a proper name and their naming convention. So for example, our creature, I could just name it main body or just creature, or just, you know, in this case, just little guy. The name of our project, underscore geo. This specification is very important. Make sure it'll really depend on your personal preference or whatever the project naming convention is. Usually a group or studio will have a naming convention that you definitely should abide by. This will keep things tidy, especially when you're handing it off to another department or another artist working on the same model, right? Like riggers, right? Very important to name your stuff. The eyes, for example, here I can specify the direction. So in this case, this would be our left eye, right? If you're looking from here. So it would be I underscore L underscore geo, right? Specifying geometry. And then we can do the same for this one, I underscore R. underscore geo. Now we should be about ready. So again, in this video, I'm just mainly going to go over the general steps, and then the theory that will be more explained in class. So the way this works, or why it is that we're doing UVs, in order to properly texture our model, especially when we're dealing with a creature or a character or something that's going to have very unique textures, UV mapping is required in order to actually properly apply those images that we're later going to be creating in something like Substance Painter. Uh, Otherwise, we would have to be painting directly on the model, and that's extremely inefficient, especially when we're dealing with models with lower topology. Essentially, we want to be able to add high resolution textures into our model without having to deal with high resolution meshes, or at the very least meshes that are very dense in topology. Right, so to start, we're still in the modeling standard workspace. We're going to click this tab over here in UV, and I can pull this out by just clicking. And the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we have no UVs, right? By default, especially since we started from a primitive, our objects do come already with a set of UVs if we go over to UV editor. Oh well, I did clean this up last video to test. But essentially, we take a closer look at the eyes. You'll notice that since we started from a cube, this is the base UV of the model, and obviously this might not necessarily represent the final shape that we have. Sort of giving you a sneak peek as to what it is supposed to look like in case of our character. You essentially separate them into sections so that we can see every single side of the character in a 2D perspective, right? So we're essentially, you can think of taking a cereal box apart without breaking it, or just a cardboard box, and we're trying to lay out all of the pieces in so that we can see it from one view. And this applies for essentially anything that you would model that you intend to texture uh, in other programs or even within Maya itself, if you wish to apply something like a seamless texture. Having clean UVs is going to be really important for the continuation of this pipeline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete these UVs so that we can start from scratch. Now you'll notice that if I select the character, nothing appears here. UVs, you can kind of think of it as it's just sort of a secondary coat we apply over our character that essentially represents that model in that 2D space. So now that we've cleaned them up, I also like deleting the history once again because deleting the UVs also adds to the history. So to avoid having any history, right, have a sterile environment, you can go ahead and delete those. And what I can do now is project new UVs over this character and then cut. So the way this is going to work, we're going to project new UVs. We're going to cut set UVs into our optimal shapes. We're going to organize or lay out those shapes. And we're going to make sure that they fit within the confines of these coordinates here, right? This U1, V1 coordinate. So to start, once we've deleted, we've made sure that all the transformations are set. We have no history. We can begin. So the first thing I do is head on over to UV, go to planar, and click this box because I want to make sure that we are projecting from camera, not a specific axis. I like doing it this way because it tends to get me a better result than just using camera-based projection, which is also here. Obviously, we have projections for like cylindrical, spherical that are really dependent on the shape that we're working on, but 99% of the time, planar really does a good job on most models. So he's going to go ahead and make sure that this is set to camera, click project, and now you'll see that we have this 2D version of our character projected on top. And if I turn on the checkerboard, you can see that since we've done no cuts, we can see this, right, these letters, we can see it in the front and in the back of our character. In this case, they're flipped. So this would not be optimal for what we want to do. Again, we want to make sure that all of the sections or the entire model is visible from a solid or a single view. So how do we go about that? Well, we first have to cut this character into sections that we can later organize. To do this, we can go over to UV and then select our 3D cut and sew tool. And this is a very versatile tool. It essentially has a couple steps in one. Have to worry too much about certain operations, so shortcuts. And I'm going to make sure that our symmetry is turned on since we're working with a symmetrical model, making sure that I am being as precise as possible. Notice that now just going over here, set it to Object X. Wherever I hover my mouse, it's also shown on the other side. So we could cut our work in half. Now, we can obviously go over some theory, but again, we're going to discuss that live in class. So, right now, we're just going to go over the steps. So now that I've projected my UVs, my first step, I'm going to go ahead and start cutting. Now, more or less where you should do this, especially in a character that is one singular shape, right? We don't have things like clothes or props that will hide these seams. So we have to really do a good job at putting them in areas that wouldn't be too conspicuous or noticeable, because seams, if you've played old school games, you'll notice that sometimes the texture sort of breaks. And in modern games or in modern applications such as Substance, seams aren't that big of a deal. We can definitely hide them using little tricks like triplanar projection. It's still good practice to hide them as well as possible or put them in areas where you would expect. Here, since our character doesn't really have any clothes or details, well, we're going to have to put them in areas that would make the most sense for them to unwrap individually. For example, the arms, the legs, and then we can do the front of the body and the back of the body, as well as the horns, separate them into separate regions. So to start, I'm just going to turn off this checkerboard so I can better see what I'm doing. And I believe if we turn this button right here, we can see the different colored UV shells. So right now we have one singular UV shell. We need to separate this into individual shells for a better result. I'm just going to go in here and pick this area. I notice that we have 3 different colors for the arms. What I did was I double clicked, and what the 3D cut and sew tool does is automatically create a seam or cut where I double clicked. You can also click once to do a cut, but double clicking, make sure that we're cutting in the actual seam around the UV shell. And do the same for the legs, the horns. Right here, even though it's looks like it's the same color, it's a separate UV shell. Notice right here. And then for the body, I'm just going to go ahead and cut from the entire middle line that we have. Have to go over and cut, and then the bottom right here. You know, it worked once the character changes color. Here he's mainly changing hues, or values, I should say. But it is working. There was like a subtle change there. And then lastly, I can do the same for the eye socket, or where the eye will be textured later on. And I'm being somewhat strategic. I'm assuming that if I wanted to add the whites of the eye, I could do it maybe around this area here. And I'm still not certain this is something that might change in future videos, whether or not this could work. I think it kind of does for now, if we look at them from just this one view here. Just turn that off. Turn on the wireframe, etc. It kind of gives us somewhat a nice result. Assuming that this, if they were darker, it could work. But again, we're going to be revisiting this anyway. What I'm doing though is just giving myself the option of just having this be a separate UV shell altogether, so that if I do end up deleting it, it doesn't affect much of the geometry. Something that's also very important to keep in mind, UVs, you tend to do them after you finish the entire model, or preferably. Obviously, there's going to be some exceptions, or there might be some needs to maybe go back and change the model, or maybe something broke and you have to go back. That tends to happen in the pipeline, right? Things don't always go as smoothly. But ideally, You want to make sure that your model is 100% done modeling wise so that you don't have to go back and redo this step. Definitely UVs is something that a whole lot of people don't enjoy doing because it is a bit of meticulous work, or you have to make sure that everything is as organized as possible. But again, you really just have to remember general steps to work. Um, right, UV mappings are not as scary once you get used to them, honestly. Though I've yet to meet a single person that actually enjoys doing UV mapping, but I digress. Anyway, what I did here for the arms, I did add this extra seam, but it's because I want to be able to cut this seam here underneath the arm without it having going all the way around. So I've effectively separated what would be the wrist, right? He does have little stumps for hands, but um, the idea is that I want to separate the arm itself from what would be the hand. So if I did have like fingers and stuff like that, it would just be easier to work independently. And I also don't want to have like a massive seam going around the arm side to side. That might be a preferable result. It'll really depend on the type of textures we want to do. But right now, I'm choosing to just separate what is the stump and then the rest of the arm, have that be separate. Now that we've done our cuts, or at the very least most of them, for this next step, we can go back if things didn't end up perfectly. That'll really, one way to really find out is by laying out this model or by essentially unfolding these segments. To do so, we hold right click, head on over to component, UV shell, we select everything, and then I'm going to hold right click again, unfold and lay out. And we end up with this result. Now you'll notice that all of the pieces are facing the same direction on my UV editor, right? We can definitely optimize the organization of this or make sure that some of these lines are straight or some of the UV shells are straightened out. This could work if we were just going to give it a basic color, but right, we want to be a little bit more careful with that. Or definitely optimize this space. We do have a lot of empty space over here that we could do something with. Essentially, what the layout and unfold does is, well, unfolds and lays out our UV shells that we've just cut. But we can go over, I'm going to exit the tool by pressing Q, and I'm going to turn off symmetry. We can definitely go in here and do some manual adjustments to these UVs. Make sure we turn on this checkerboard. And make sure that we are, for example, staying within the confines of this UV shell or these UV coordinates. Given that exiting them could give us some issues in the texture. It might not fully show up, or there are some programs, for example, like ZBrush, that if you import a UV that is overlapping from this coordinate, it just completely breaks that UV shell, and you would have to redo it again. So to avoid that, making sure that everything is within this area. I can just scale that down a little bit. We can also, once we orient them, we can press Control L, selecting everything, of course, Control L, and that kind of refits everything. But once again, it's sort of not perfect. And even this can cause us some issues. So we can go ahead and scale that down a little bit, right? And then maybe do some manual adjustments here. The arms, we can place them more or less over here. This would be where the eyes are. This is a hand. Notice how wherever I move this texture, this sort of follows around along. Kind of straighten these out more or less. This would be our horn. So the horns, you'll notice that the checkerboard is stretching out. So if this happens, we can definitely cut this specific region. We can cut them in half and it should give us like a pretty clean result. But that's also something we want to avoid as much as possible, which is the warping or deformation of our texture. So an alternative here might be to better cut our UV shell. So I'm going back to the 3D cut and sew tool and then cutting these in half. Again, the seam shouldn't be too noticeable in certain angles. Again, assuming we could also give this like a solid color where it wouldn't be that big of a deal. And now I can select these regions. And instead of doing the whole reselect everything and then lay it out, what I'm going to do instead is just go over to my UV editor itself. And by the way, to navigate it, it's the same controls as you would for the main camera, right? You can just Alt middle mouse to move around and then zoom in and out with the scroll wheel or Alt and right click. So for these 4 islands, what I'm going to do is just Control U or modify and unfold. Here's a shortcut, right? Control U. Now you notice that the texture isn't as stretched, right? It's not perfect, but now it's a lot more uniform. Essentially, you want to keep the squares as squares. And now we can just orient the horns, making sure that they're aiming in the same direction. There's also another rule of thumb, essentially, for things like, in this case, the horns, or if you were working something like planks, right, wood. You want to make sure that all of the islands are somewhat aligned in a similar orientation, either vertically or horizontally. And this will be more relevant when we start actually texturing. But essentially, I want to make sure that all of my um, islands are somewhat, especially if they're going to have the same pattern, specifically if they're going to have the same pattern, I want to make sure that they have the same orientation so that the patterns aren't, for example, I have some of them horizontal and the other ones vertically and completely, right, messing around with that alignment when we're texturing them. And for this step, honestly, you want to make sure that you are optimizing or maximizing your space. Sometimes you can just get away with laying everything out automatically, but you could also do some hand placing of your UVs. This might not be the most optimal, but at the same time, there's only so many pieces I have. Another thing I do want to do is preserve or maintain a similar resolution for the entirety of the model, especially if it's one singular piece. By that I mean is, notice that if I increase or decrease the scale, the squares, right, the bigger the UV shell is, the smaller the squares, or the higher the resolution, more pixels essentially within the image. And the smaller, the bigger the squares, or the lower the resolution. So making sure that at the very least in a something like a body or right that's going to be visible, or in this case our creature, we want to make sure that the resolution is relatively the same so that we don't have that discrepancy because it'll make seams stand out a lot more. Or the resolutions you're just going to be able to notice, right? Here's might be higher resolution and you get lower resolution in the hands, and that might be a bit distracting. We can also do things like adding, for example, other pieces within the same space without necessarily combining them. So you can maybe find a home for these eyes around here. And since the eyes are a separate piece altogether, we can maybe get away with having a different resolution. But keep in mind things like clothing or armor, you might want to keep a same resolution for those pieces. So for the eyes, what we can go ahead and do is actually, I'm going to leave this shape alone. They should be identical. So I'm just going to work on this one and go to UV, reconsole, and then make one cut. And this is a perfect example. Eyes, I could get away with having a higher resolution on the front facing island. I could also just delete this, but again, I may want the versatility of having the entire piece for now. But technically, we could totally delete the backside of the object that's not visible or even clipping through the model. Um, but again, I want to have the options available just in case. So what you could do is once you lay this out, the green part is the backside. So something people tend to do for eyes is that they'll make the back of the eye a lot smaller. Again, it's not being shown to the camera, so you could sometimes just fill this out with like a solid color, right? Like red or something. And then the entire eye shape can maximize the overall resolution by doing something like this. Now, in this case, I'm definitely just going to be adding a solid color, maybe just black for this eye shape, right? So this is overkill, to say the least. So what I plan to do instead, just maybe lay this out and then select the body shape. And I'm going to try using the texel density or tensile density of this shape and then paste that over to this one. The tensile density, right, for all intents and purposes, you can just think of it as the overall size of the UV, or how much resolution is in the UV shell relative to its size within the UV editor space, right? So over here, the UV toolkit, if you don't have this turned on, if you only have this, you should just be able to go to UV and it should just show up. Let me see if I can just close this and then turn that back on, UV editor, right? It just kind of pops back up. And I'm going to go to transform. And then I'm going to get the textile density from this object and then select the eye shapes. And then I'm going to set that textile density. Now you notice how, right, they're essentially the same resolution, but the size is a lot smaller, right? You can put them over here. Right, that's assuming we're only going to work with one material, but that's what we're going to be doing at the end of the video, or near the end. There we go. And then I could just copy or reduplicate this eye and move it over here. Or I can try selecting the objects. I believe it's from target to source. So I select first this one and then this one. No, it's source to target, I believe. So you first select the object with the main UVs, and then you select the object with the UVs you want to essentially change to. I'm going to go over to mesh, transfer attributes, and then I want to transfer not the vertex position, just the UV set. Turn that to on. Color sets just in case. And vertex position, turn that off because I don't want to basically reposition this object over here. And then the sample space, I'm going to try topology. Sometimes you can try component or world. I'm just going to try this and then apply, see what happens. And it kind of worked. I say kinda because it gave us the cut in a different direction. Uh, Honestly, not super sure why I did it in this orientation, considering that it's the same mirrored object, but it is a box, so it would have the same side. So let's try maybe instead of topology, let's try component. Oh, that broke. What about local? There we go. See, local sample space, that kind of got the job done. And I can leave this here. And what I essentially also did was that I mirrored or I'm overlapping the UV, one on top of the other. We could definitely get away with this in terms of like something like an eye, for example, that's going to be the same material. Um, or you can do things for like, essentially, if you're going to have a repeating um, element, or it's maybe you want to keep symmetry and optimize space. This is more common in something like video games, um, especially for like low resolution models. You can overlap your UVs, and that saves a lot of space um, in texturing, and also it saves a lot of time because you're effectively just mirroring that texture. But again, it's mainly reserved for optimization. So if you want to have a higher resolution texture, you might not overlap them, or if you want to have asymmetrical texturing, you definitely wouldn't want to overlap your UVs because, right, you're going to have mirroring in things like text or patterns, for example. So this is pretty good for this model as is. And then we can just check, again, our UV editor. And we can definitely optimize the space a little bit, but I'm just gonna move this more or less over here. And it's also very important to have a bit of bleeding space between your UV shells, right? This is a lot, but again, there's only so many UVs that we have. So definitely if we were working on something a lot more complex, like a vehicle or a character with a lot of clothes, belts, things like that, well, in that case, we can definitely like pack these UVs a lot better. Um, right, this is something that really depends from or changes from model to model, but it's still the same principle, right? We project UVs, we cut them, we lay them out, and then we organize them, make sure everything's nice and right, pretty. Oh, this is it for the UV section. Now let's do some final cleanup here. You'll notice that we've added to our construction history, so we definitely have to delete that again. This will be around one of the last times we're going to be doing this, because for rigging animation, you do not want to delete your history, believe you me. But yeah, you just delete history one more time, and then we're going to assign a material. And for the end of this video, we're going to be assigning and then prepping, exporting this model to then later work on Substance Painter to actually give it some color and material to our creature, right? So to finish up, I'm going to hold right click, assign new material, and then I'm going to assign a Lambert. Honestly, you can assign something like a AI standard surface, but I prefer Lamberts because again, this might change. This isn't going to be the final material. This is mainly going to be a bit of a housekeeping routine. Just make sure that the objects that are UV'd have an independent material. And materials, again, we're going to go over the theory later on, but right, when I export this over to Substance, I want to know exactly what material working with. So assigning a new material is also good for organization. And what I tend to do is just name it the name of the character or object, and then I will type MTL for model or mat for model or for material, sorry, MTL for material or mat for material. And they're essentially done and ready for export. And to wrap it up, right, this last thing, I can export my model, select everything, make sure I'm going over to export selection, and right, find my folder, go over to date modified, go plasmids, and over here, I'm gonna make a new folder for FBXs or just exported objects, and change my file type to FBX export. I prefer FBX because it stores material information and joints and stuff like that. USD also works, which is the one I had prior. But FBX, I just kind of like it more. So I'm gonna name this just our little guy underscore FBX. Again, just to specify that this is a format, and then export. And that's about it. This model is now ready to be imported into Substance for texturing. There's anything else to keep in mind, that's about it, right? Make sure you design your materials, make sure you name everything. And very important, I'm gonna save as a new scene here. Take this over to my class vids, and this is gonna be exercise number 2 or UVs, right? Depending on where you're working. Now I can go back between different versions of my project just in case something broke, right? Go back to, there you go. Right, now everything's named, has its materials, and it has its UVs. Nice and pretty, right? Make sure everything's organized, right? Should be it.